Hello everyone, welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Himbar, and today I'm going to be doing another video. I don't do this type very often. In fact, the most recent one that I can think of this type of video was when I recorded Chauvinistic Love of Words, probably about 2 years ago. And so this is going to be a lecture of sorts. I'm going to try to keep it short because essentially I'm just reading an essay that I wrote, an essay for a class just like Chauvinistic Love of Words. I'm not going to have slides, though. My preferred type of lecture is to give you a presentation with slides. That's how I prefer to be taught in class. And I know I don't do anything that anyone likes really, as far as like YouTube videos are concerned, where people want to be told with really moving parts and flashy images and stuff like that. I don't edit these. That's not how I consume knowledge because often when that is done that way, it feels fake. Now, I know it goes to a larger audience that way, but I like just these conversations. So essentially, let me get right into this. I'm just going to go over this topic. And that topic today actually is the beginning of Icelandic history and kind of related more specifically to vernacular writing of the north of Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. Okay. So the writing of annals and chronicles in the north of Europe arrived after conversion to Christianity and the broader introduction of literacy, particularly in Latin. Whether it be Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, the Frankish Annales Laracensis Majoris, Isidore Seville's Historia de Regibus Gotorum, Vendilarum et Suevorum. These contained a tradition of, or continued a tradition of Latin writing taken from the late Western Roman Empire, where it had converted, and the patristic texts of early Christianity, specifically Christian texts. So while peoples in the West and South of Europe spoke Latin as a mother tongue, many in the North did not. Of course, over time, Vulgar Latin would have evolved into the Romance languages we know today, but for much of the medieval period, speakers of said languages viewed themselves as speaking Latin, those speakers of the Romance languages. This is evident in the designation of those languages, what they give themselves, how they describe themselves. We have Romans in Old French or Romance in Old Occitan, to name two. These are actually whence the modern English word romance, which is synonymous with chivalric romances, right? But as these romances were first being written by the likes of the Angevin named Wace, or shortly after by the esteemed Chrétien de Troyes, they wrote in Romans. So as it was the designator of the local vernacular of the people that were once Romans, right? And so the name of the tongue they spoke got attached to the popular form of storytelling that they were known for. So texts until this time were largely kept in academic shape, right, in proper Latin, as the medieval churchgoers would hear their Masson, rather than the vulgar dialect that we would now call Old French and Old Occitan. As these romances were in verse, though, the dialect of Old French would not have the same rules of prosody as Latin verse does, and thus these oral stories, when written, were done in the dialect rather than the academic tongue of Latin, even though, again, still in like an Old French period, these Old French speakers would have thought they were speaking Latin. It's just these stories are done in their dialect of it, as vulgar Latin, right? It would not be until the Anglo-Norman Chronicle Geoffrey Gaimar wrote Histoire des Anglais, or Histoire des Anglais, or something like that, more modern French, but in the 1130s, that something identifiable as French would be used to write a history rather than a story. Ironically, this history is not about the French, but it's actually about the English. Bede is oft-cited as the father of English history. He wrote in the early 8th century. His native language would have been an Anglian dialect of Old English, or what is sometimes called Anglo-Saxon, continuing the tradition of historiography. He wrote in Latin, though his works would later be translated into Old English. And while not the earliest Latin historian in Anglo-Saxon England, he was an adult when the oldest extant text of Anglo-Latin was written, the Vita Sancti Cuthberti, the Life of St. Cuthbert, which was written between 699, and 705 in the genre of hagiography, which is a biography concerned with holy persons. It would not be until the later half of the 9th century that Alfred introduced the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in English, who held in his court English writing with high esteem, as we can tell from his writings, such as the Prelude to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care. So what about the Norse-speaking neighbors of the septentrional English? So the peoples of Scandinavia converted Christianity well after the Anglo-Saxons. Most of our surviving sources in Old Norse are specifically defined as Old Icelandic, a thriving literary language. The first history we have of record is of Saemundr Sigfússon's History of the Norwegian Kings, which was likely written in Latin. And Snorri Sturluson tells us that Ari Thorgilsson was the first to write history in Old Norse, and that would be Islendingabok. Iceland decided at their nationwide moot, essentially the All Thing, to hold one religion amongst themselves in 999 AD. This conversion is the main focus of Ari's narrative. The Icelanders chose Christianity for this common creed, and of course literacy would not have gone from Gothar reading runes to a strong ecclesiastical training center of Latin in short time. These changes, especially when decided by a moot arbitrarily, take time to gain infrastructure. An official see was not appointed in Iceland until 1082, which with the first bishop in the diocese of Skálholt being Gizur Islefsson during the investiture crisis. Gizur was a second-generation bishop, though his father was considered a missionary bishop with no official see. Skálholt, that would become the official, was Islefr's homestead, though. Islendingabok begins with the settlement of Iceland in the latter half of the 9th century during the reign of Harald Fairhair of Norway. Throughout the text, a cultural connection is readily established to Norway. Though the Icelanders have quite a unique flavor among Scandinavians, the settlers are simple folk I don't mean that in a negative way, a stock that seems to have largely worshipped practical Thor rather than the elite favored Odin. But most notably to medievalists today, they were the storytellers and writers for the rest of the Scandinavian world. Pretty much all our Old Norse texts are really from Iceland. While Ari described the law of Iceland coming from Norway, the island itself is established as a commonwealth until annexation by Norway in 1262. Early on, there is also a connection made by Ari to England, as in mentioning the settlement during the reign of Harald Fairhair, he specifies the year as 870, when Ivar, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, had Sate and been king of the English killed, and that was 870 winters after the birth of Christ. The Islendingabok begins appropriately then with Iceland, as it is a history of Iceland. There's no effort to connect Iceland to a broader classical or Christian tradition, as you see in other chronicles, as in the first annals of many medieval histories. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, begins with events from 60 BC and goes up until 449 AD when it really starts with English history, dealing with the events outside of Britain before that. The Histoire des Anglais originally began with the histories of the Trojans and how a character like Brutus connects to the Britons via Aeneas. These sections are lost actually in our day, but it remains that both the compiler of the common stock for the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Gaimar are taking from works that they knew by scholars such as Isidore Seville, Jerome, Eusebius of Caesarea. While Ari does not make such connections in the chapters of his Islendingabok, the practice was not foreign to Icelanders, nor was it foreign to Ari, really. Snorri Sturluson, born 30 years after the death of Ari, and writing in the early 13th century, does connect Iceland and its past with Troy. Instead of Brutus journeying to Britain, which admittedly was first mentioned in a 9th century British work rather than that by an Anglo-Saxon. But the Norman conquests, English identity would flux to merge more with the British and have the English connecting to figures like King Arthur, who would have been their ancestors' enemy and not a traditional figure they would have connected with. Snorri writes that Thor was of Troy, specifically that he was the son of Menon and Troan, this latter being the daughter of Priam. Thor journeys north and marries Sibyl, whom Icelanders call Sif, he says, and 21 generations later Odin is born from their progeny. Since these Trojans lived in the middle of the world, which is more beautiful and better, in his words, and so naturally the inhabitants are generally endowed. They're wise, they're kind, they're beautiful and skilled in all manners. These beings are then excusable for being confused for gods to the pre-Christian Icelanders. You don't get such specific excuses in the Anglo-Saxon sources, though. Though Beowulf is full of intuitive monotheists, the Angles and most Saxon genealogies, excepting the Essex pedigree, trace their lineage to Woden, same as Odin. And since the House of Wessex managed to survive the Norman conquest, King Charles III himself claims such an ancestor as well in Odin. These Anglo-Saxon pedigrees show up in a number of manuscripts and texts, from the Historia Brittonum to the Vespasian manuscript, but the most elaborate is actually the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Atex or Parker manuscript from the year 855, tracing the family all the way back to Noah. The Islendingabok actually does the same. So appended to the text is one Langfethgatal. This text seems to come from the England collection of royal genealogies or a very similar source. It was this Langfethgatal that Alexander M. Bruce suggests Snorri had in hand when writing the prologue to his prose Edda mentioned above. In this genealogy, Ari traces legendary figures as seen in royal pedigrees, but he traces them back to himself. He goes through the kings of Norway and shows by lineage that his family has a right to their chieftainship, a key aspect of the Commonwealth, though, of course, as Korban points out, he promotes the monarchy of Norway by indicating the origin of Icelandic chieftains being from Norway, which really isn't a bad thing. Icelanders would not have found this a bad thing when they finally decided to lose their freedom, in a sense, and come under the rulership of the kings of Norway. Anyways, that's an aside. So Ari's history makes an interesting comparison also, as it is a liminal period that he wrote in, right? It had been a little more than a century since conversion, and a little more than a century later, Iceland would officially be part of Norway, right? They also overlap in other ways, such as Rolfr in chapter 8 being the same as Bishop Rolf mentioned for the year 1050 in the C text of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. There are many early missionary bishops in Iceland from England, and these two nations are firmly part of the northern current of European interactions at the time. But as Ari wrote, that was swiftly changing. And while there is no poetry in Ari's text, as occasionally found in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, such as the 973 entry for the coronation of Edgar, the Chronicle was also written by many hands and varies from each annal. Ari wrote a source relying on accounts from people he knew personally and from texts in the interconnected sea of northern Europe, a sea that was turbulent and constantly seemed to increase store for loss and loss for store. And of course, I don't really need to mention it, but Ari was writing this all by himself as well. He is the one hand. So around that time, though, Icelandic was flourishing as a literary language, helped on by the prestige accounted to English. English itself was becoming sparse in literature, as after the Norman conquests, new texts were almost all written in Latin or French. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle survives in several manuscripts, most of which in shortly after the Norman conquest in 1066. The major exception is the Peterborough Chronicle, with periods of events being recorded up to 1154 in English. And after this, history would not be written in English until Lochman's Brut at the turn of the 13th century. While such a literary loss was profound for the next several centuries, Iceland was more fortunate. English underwent great changes in this high and late medieval periods, losing 85% of the lexicon in Old English. Lexicon present in Old English does not survive in modern English, though I think it is fair to point out, and this is not mentioned here, but that if you take the 100 most common words in modern English, 95% of them are Germanic, and 90% of those come from the Old English. The other 5% are probably like Norse, and so still very common. And grammatically, it is a Germanic language. So such early medieval history is inaccessible to modern English speakers, right? And as such, the history is largely forgotten, right? You don't have people reading Lochman's Brut, besides the fact that it's just kind of boring anyways. Or you don't have people reading the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle because it's just unparsable. You can't read it as a modern English speaker without some trainings, with taking classes, or just figuring out yourself after some time. So Iceland, even though it is annexed by Norway, Iceland has had a common language with said nation. The history Ari wrote is relatively accessible to speakers of the conservative language of Icelandic. The stories written in sagas are still known by the majority of Icelanders today. The cultural continuum of the earliest history in Iceland is intact from the beginnings of the 12th century to today, and you cannot say that about English. And so that is kind of what I wanted to look at here. That's pretty much the end of my words. So let me know what you think. This is something I will probably take and shape and mess with more. But to me, when I was reading through Islendingabok and other works for this class, this Old Norse literature class, sagas and myths and whatnot, that it seemed to connect. This stuff seemed to connect with the stuff I was already more familiar with, say in like Anglo-Saxon England. And so I think it is interesting, though, as most of the stuff I read in Old English or Middle English is not. It is not something you know. And one thing that became very obvious when you read Icelandic texts is that people know them in Iceland today, right? It seems like everyone's descended from Egil Skallagrimsson, right? And that everyone knows the story of Egil Saga, whether they are descended from him or not, right? And you don't have that continuation in England. right? There is a lot of history going on, and I think a big part of that is the switch from the north, England being connected with the north of Europe, to being connected with like the west of Europe, with France and stuff after the Norman conquest, and then those problems that you get then, that, yeah, they come to fruition.